Welcome to the Power Monkey Podcast, where we chat with the best in the world about what they do. I'm your host, Dave Durante, with my co-host, Chad Vaughn, and on today's episode, we have Dr. Mike Molloy. Mike has been on the podcast many times before, one of our favorite guests. He is the owner and founder of M2 Performance Nutrition, and he is known primarily for the great work he does creating nutrition plans for athletes of all levels, from games level competitors all the way through to people that are just weekend warriors. But today we're going to be talking about a specific topic. We're going to be talking about hormones and how they relate to better athletic achievement, being an athlete, and how your hormones relate to better training on a daily basis. I learned a lot in this one. I think we had some great conversations, so we hope you guys enjoy this one too. All right, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Mike Molloy back with us again. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Good. Good to be back as always, guys.
Good. It's awesome having you on, and we know that our listeners love hearing from you. The previous one, we can't tell if it was either you or Dr. Jamie, but it was one of our most downloaded podcasts we've ever had. So you are a superstar.
I'm going to go with Jamie on that one, but I'm happy to ride in her wake.
Sounds good. But we wanted to continue because we like the idea of touching on something kind of specific, like we did with metabolism last time, and talk a little bit about hormones. And hormones is probably more of a broad topic than it is a specific topic, but specifically about how hormones and what hormones are related to fitness, how we can optimize for those hormones, and maybe talk a little bit about maybe some differences between male and female and those kind of things. So I know there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of different tangents that we can probably go into, but I just want to start out with some general information for the everyday listener out there. It doesn't come from a science background, doesn't have your knowledge base. It's probably heard a little bit about hormones here and there. There are so many different hormones that affect the body in so many different ways. Can we just go through a few that you have kind of at the top of your list when it comes to the importance with regards to their relation to fitness and training in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you're getting at, there's so many hormones, and, to try and really separate them all out is sort of like a dangerous game in and of itself. But I think, for your average listener, there's a number that we can start to think about as sort of being, the highest priority list on there. So the biggest ones that I think most people are probably the most familiar with as well would be the sex hormones, right? So testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. The big one that gets all the play, of course, is testosterone, especially, for men, but it's equally as important in women. And so those are really critical as it relates to a number of different biological processes. But as it relates to training, they have incredibly important impacts on things like the anabolic process. And when I say anabolic, I mean the muscle building process. So those are sort of like one class. I would say we call those sort of like the sex hormones, and there's some derivatives that come from those, things like DHEA, et cetera. Of course, there's other hormones that are more directly involved in things like repairing muscle and growing, things literally like growth hormone, right? Which is produced in response to exercise as well as different phases in life. So that's another entire hormonal system. And then there's another component that anyone has been, fortunate or unfortunate enough to listen to me talk for long enough. There's the stress system, and the major hormone that I think about as it relates to that one is called cortisol. Sometimes gets a bad rap as sort of like a negative hormone, but in reality, it's sort of one of those things where the dose makes either the benefit or the poison, depending upon how you're looking at things. And so I call that the stress response system or the cortisol system. And so that's another major one that I think, especially in the world of high intensity functional fitness, things of that nature, is incredibly important and something that we should be paying attention to. So we got the sex hormones, we got the growth hormone pathway, we have cortisol, and I would say those are probably the three dominant ones that most people are going to think about. Of course, there are others, but that's where I would kind of hang my hat.
Okay. Hey, do you mind just breaking down each of those a little bit? Can we start with the sex hormones a little bit? You talked about the one that probably gets a lot more in discussion, especially nowadays with older men wanting to increase their daily dosages of taking testosterone and things like that. But can we talk a little bit about testosterone in terms of what it does in the body and its relationship between how it affects men and women differently?
Yeah, completely. So testosterone is important for things like, of course, during development, reproductive organ formation. It's important for spermatogenesis, literally making sperm. That's why when people take artificial testosterone, their sperm count drops to 0. It's responsible for a lot of things like body and facial hair growth. Importantly, it's actually responsible for what we consider to be like the male body fat distribution. So men tend to carry more body weight or more body fat, excuse me, in their midsection. We call this like visceral fat. And importantly for all of our listeners and really generally anyone is that the more visceral fat that you have, we generally consider that to be a negative thing. It correlates negatively with a huge number of chronic diseases, things like type 2 diabetes, metabolic disorder, heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. It's something we want to try to avoid. Testosterone is incredibly important, like I was saying already, for the anabolic process, the driving and the creation of new muscle. It's important for bone growth and for bone health overall. It's important for your sex drive. So more testosterone in general is going to lead to a longer or stronger sex drive. And then last but not least, it drives the production of another hormone called erythropoietin, which is important for red blood cell formation. Red blood cells are, of course, incredibly important cells for a number of reasons, but the primary one, of course, is oxygen delivery to the entire body, which, again, if you're into fitness, tends to be a relatively important thing. So that's sort of like the basic functions of testosterone at a high level. What we found, I'll stop there for a second. Any questions about that, guys?
Yeah, hundreds, but we can kind of Chad, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, no, I think I have one question specifically for testosterone. It's always said to be, the hormone that helps with muscle building. But I think what more listeners than not are concerned with, because, I'm at an age in life where I'm not trying to get any bigger or necessarily build muscles. But when you say build muscle, does that mean also repairing muscle? And if not, what hormone is more so responsible for muscle recovery?
Yeah, I mean, so to say that, yes, testosterone is definitely one of those things that helps to drive the muscle repair process. I would say that growth hormone is also equally as important. When you exercise, the two of the major hormones that are produced pretty much immediately afterwards are ones that we've talked about outside of testosterone, or the sex hormones, which are growth hormone and cortisol. And they kind of have opposing actions. So we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but that's okay. So growth hormone, of course, drives more of an anabolic process, and cortisol tends to drive more of a catabolic or a breakdown process. So one of the things that cortisol does is it tells the body to take amino acids or protein in your muscle fibers and throughout the body, really, and to break them down and to convert them into glucose, sugar, essentially, through a process called gluconeogenesis. And so that's why one of the reasons that we want to sort of monitor our cortisol levels in some form or another, and make sure that we're doing what we can to decrease their production after training is a good idea, because we want to stop that catabolic process and get the anabolic process started as fast as we possibly can. So there are some connections there to testosterone that is probably not worth going into for today with our audience, but yeah, there's definitely relationships there. And touching on another point, like what you said, Chad, is like as you get older, you maybe aren't necessarily interested in building massive amounts, but you want to hold on to what you have. Interestingly, testosterone levels decline pretty uniformly as we get older. So they peak, as you might expect, in our teenage, early 20s, and then they undergo sort of this slow decline throughout the rest of our life. What we're learning these days is that people are having even greater reductions in testosterone levels at earlier ages, and the slope, like that decreased slope, is getting stronger and stronger and stronger as we go on and on, due most likely to things like the modern world that we live in, increased stress, more coffee, more alcohol, worse sleep patterns, perhaps things like exposures to plastics, parabens, and pesticides. All of these have been sort of hypothesized and tested on some level to show decreased levels of testosterone. And so what we know now is that about as many as 20% of men, which is a pretty high number, have what we would consider to be chronically low levels of testosterone, despite having no sort of clinical manifestation that should cause it directly.
So to add on top of that, you talk about the increase in decline and the rate of decline. Is it also true that we as humans are living a little bit longer?
Yeah, but the decline is like sort of even if you're correct for age, it's still decreasing at a more rapid rate, even at younger populations. And the one thing I forgot to add is, of course, is obesity. So obesity is thought to be a major driver of testosterone decrease as well. And so, you know, of course, at a population level, we continue to get, you know, larger and larger and fatter and fatter. So how do we actually kind of like, how do we battle this? How do we kind of reverse that process? What are things that we can do to try to keep our testosterone levels at a higher level or higher, keep testosterone at a higher level? So of course, one is exercise. That's going to, you know, try to counteract the negative impacts of things like obesity. We want to manage our stress, you know, so doing things like, you know, going for walks, breathing exercises, meditation, journaling. We want to make sure that we're getting, you know, 7+ hours of sleep per night. We want to make sure that we're not overdoing it on the alcohol side of things. There is some research, though I'm not fully convinced on it, that marijuana also can potentially lead to decreased testosterone as well. So something that, you know, you might want to take into consideration if you have lower levels to begin with. And then if you're really looking to kind of take this to another level, like I talked about, there's this category of things we call the three P. So plastics, parabens, which are a set of chemicals that you often find associated with modern things like makeup, deodorant, antiperspirants, things like that, and then pesticides. So if you have the financial ability to eat organic and things like that, there may be some benefit to it as well. So those are like sort of the basic places that I would start as well. And yeah, I think that's a good place for the vast majority of our listeners.
Now, one of the things that we've noticed quite a bit is this kind of surge in artificial testosterone usage, and you know, to kind of maybe supplement this drastic drop in what we're seeing. What are your recommendations, or what are your thoughts on taking this, age, dosages, the benefits of it? What are your thoughts around the artificial?
Sure. Yeah. So artificial testosterone, I think, is something that men can consider. But I think if you're going to do it, there's a number of different factors that you should be considering. One is, you know, familial history. You know, do you have any history of cancer, heart disease, things like that, that are, you know, at a greater risk than you might have for an average person? Because testosterone supplementation is going to increase your risk for all of those types of things. If you remember back earlier in the talk, I talked about how testosterone drives the production of erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell count. So if you're taking more testosterone than you potentially should be, or even to an extent, you know, just cranking yourself back up to that, you know, 18-year-old version of yourself, you're going to accumulate more red blood cells. With that, there's an increased risk for clotting, strokes, heart attacks, and things like that. So it's one of those things that you want to be really careful about. Secondly, I think listeners should be aware of when you push that, you know, that button, like I'm going to take testosterone now, you're pretty much pushing it for the rest of your life to an extent. If you're not careful with it, like, so for example, people that use testosterone for performance enhancing benefits, the ones that are really good at it have very clear cycle times. They know exactly how much they should be taking. They have times where they come off of it. They are doing things like using aromatase inhibitors to make sure that it's not overly converting to estrogen. They're monitoring their testosterone levels with blood work. They may be donating blood to an extent to get rid of some of the excess red blood cells. They're doing a lot of things to try to modulate and keep themselves in very specific ranges. When you get a prescription from your doctor, the typical sort of approach is just, okay, we're going to take this, you know, every day or every couple of days. And there is nothing about cycling or anything else like that. And it does shut down completely your own endogenous sex hormone production. So if I take fake testosterone, my body will essentially stop producing its own version of that. And coming off of it can be incredibly unfun experience. Like, it can be done. Like, don't get me wrong, it can be done, but energy levels are going to suck. Your sex drive is going to be in the tank. The gym performance is going to be horrific. You're not going to be a fun person to be around, and you're going to be pretty unhappy. So, I think most people look at the positive side of, oh, I'm going to start taking this. And I just want the listeners to be aware that there are consequences to it that you should be aware of, and that this is not oh, let's just give it a shot and see what happens type thing.
Now, just because obviously each of these seems like each of the hormones could be a whole episode in and of itself, but for the purposes of trying to keep things a little bit more succinct, can we talk about the female side of things a little bit and speak on estrogen, progesterone a little bit in terms of how they relate here?
Yeah, for sure. So estrogen and progesterone are in fact, they're all sort of derivatives of one another, for lack of a better term. And, the female sex hormones do so many things. Like, we could literally talk for hours about this. In fact, at M2, we have an entire lecture series on hormonal health, of which I think 3 of the lectures are dedicated to the female sex hormones. And so, it's involved with reproduction. It's involved with, the menstrual cycle, female fat patterning, all of those types of things. I think what's probably a more useful conversation to our listeners is to think about maybe looking at physical training and exercise and how it can potentially lead to disruptions in those sex hormones. So for men, like I talked about, testosterone is relatively straightforward. It just peaks in your teenage, early 20 years and slowly declines throughout your life. For women, it's all over the place, right? Estrogen rises and then it decreases. Then estrogen and progesterone both rise and then they both decrease. And this happens roughly on a 28-day cycle for the vast majority of their mature life. When a woman starts to exercise and potentially is not eating enough food, not managing her stress appropriately, that cycle can become disrupted. And it can lead to what we call amenorrhea, which is essentially the lack of a menstrual cycle. And there are a number of different sort of consequences to that I think we want to, or women would want to avoid in that situation. To get at like sort of the crux of it relatively quickly, the body has to decide at any given point in time, like, how to conserve energy, right? And there are certain biological processes that cannot be, taken away. So the brain needs to work, your heart needs to pump, your lungs need to breathe, your kidneys need to do what they need to do, et cetera, et cetera. But there are things that are expendable. And one of them becomes, if you're not eating enough food, that menstrual cycle is totally and utterly unnecessary, right? And if you think about it from a evolutionarily survival point of view, it makes a lot of sense. If stress is high, if food resources are low, is that a great time for a woman or for a family to bring a new child into the world? And the answer is probably no, right? And so the menstrual cycle and the ability to reproduce is one of the first things to go when a woman is not eating enough food to support the amount of activity that she's doing. So I'll stop there for a second. Questions, thoughts, comments about that?
No, this all makes sense to me right now. I get where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the downside of that is that there's a number of sort of negative associations or negative impacts of not having a menstrual cycle, not having the appropriate production of estrogen and progesterone on a monthly basis. So one is decreased hunger control. The appetite control is way lower. The second one would be a decreased muscle formation and remodeling. So testosterone often gets a lot of play as being like an anabolic hormone, but so is estrogen. Estrogen, in fact, has a number of anabolic processes on the body. We see an increased use of protein as a fuel source during especially aerobic training. So, loss of menstrual cycle is most commonly associated with endurance training. And so in that situation, women are much more likely to break down their muscle, convert it through that process I was talking about earlier, gluconeogenesis, and turn it into carbohydrate and turn it into glucose to use as a fuel source so they can get muscle wasting. What else? They have increased cortisol, so that stress hormone that we talked about, that starts to go way up through the roof in many cases. Their metabolic rate decreases pretty dramatically. So the amount of calories that they're burning, even at rest, starts to drop. That's not necessarily a great thing for many people. Increased risk of injury, worsened athletic performance, increased risk of depression. And then the one that probably a lot of women, especially people from the endurance community, hear a lot about is bone mineral density loss. So women that have amenorrhea have a massive increased risk of things like stress fractures and things like that. I don't want to just sort of say this is only an endurance problem, because you certainly can find things like that in other sports. I've seen it in underfed CrossFit athletes where they've like literally broken their femurs doing things that should never happen, you know? So there's a lot of negative consequences to not having a menstrual cycle, and that most likely is being driven, at least for the vast majority of women, by an under consumption of calories.
That's interesting. So from your world of working with athletes that are training at a pretty high level, the way to combat the potential for amenorrhea is just be more conscious of the dietary component. And I would imagine that sleep is a component there, but the dietary component is probably the one that's missed out.
Completely. Yeah. So for a long time, people just thought it was a body fat issue, right? They said, oh, if you drop below a certain body fat percentage, that's when your menstrual cycle disappears. And the problem with that is that we know that there's a large number of very, very lean women that still have a menstrual cycle. And then there's women that have plenty of body fat, but have lost it, likely due to under consuming food. And so there's this new term that's called energy availability, which essentially says, you know, how much food are you eating, and how much exercise are you doing? How many calories are you outputting through exercise? And if you put the metrics into that, and then the number comes out below whatever the cutoff point is, you are at an incredibly high risk of losing your menstrual cycle. And so it's kind of hard to do with something like CrossFit, because, you know, the amount of training, the amount of calories that we burn on a day-to-day basis is so variable. But I also don't think it's necessary to run that. If you are a woman that had an active menstrual cycle, and either you're training more and eating less, and now your cycle has disappeared, it is very logical to assume that that is in fact the problem. And I think the next place that most women kind of go is, well, I'm just trying to lose weight. I want to be a lower body fat percentage. If I'm 12% body fat, won't I be fitter than I am if I'm 18% body fat? And there's enough evidence out there to say that that's not the case. And there's one really a case study that I absolutely like to share with all of my female athletes that are kind of like thinking that way. So there's a female collegiate runner who had amenorrhea, so lack of a menstrual cycle, for 14 months. She had chronic fatigue, multiple injuries, and she was brought into this clinical trial where they increased her food literally just by 300 calories per day. It made her take, I think, like an extra rest day, or backed off her training a little bit. What they found was her cortisol levels, that stress hormone that breaks down your muscle, decreased by 50%. She saw increases in other sex hormones, things called like luteinizing hormone, what we haven't talked about yet, that are really, really critical for driving a healthy cycle. And she saw massive performance improvements. So she set personal records all the way from 800 meters all the way to 10,000 meters in track, qualified for NCAA finals, and she had never done any of that before in her career. So eating more food correlated with all of these benefits on a hormonal level and in her performance on the track as well. And interestingly, she went from something like I think it was like 9 or 10% body fat to like 14% body fat during that process. So heavier and yet substantially fitter, at least in her sport.
And can you just clarify there too, that you're saying that that's purely a caloric increase? There's not like specific foods. It's not like saying you need to eat this type of food. It's just saying there was a caloric increase. If you're new to these symptoms and you're not having your cycle, just a caloric increase is going to benefit you. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I think you know, from my perspective as a nutrition coach, I could like try to refine that for carbohydrates and stuff in some cases, but in this story, like, no, the most important thing is just more, just get more food in.
Can we jump to cortisol, since we've touched on it a little bit too, and talk a little bit about the stress hormones? I feel like this one is a big one for most people. I know it is for me with how stressed I am on a daily basis. So let's talk a little bit about cortisol.
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said earlier on, like cortisol gets a bad rap as like exclusively being a negative hormone. But fun fact, if we don't have it, we can't live. Like you would die. So, I want to make sure that that's pretty clear. So, cortisol's major job is to increase blood glucose levels, to provide energy to your muscles, and more specifically, I think, to your brain during a stressful situation. So basically, like you have some sort of stressful event going on in your life. Usually, I think from an evolutionary point of view, they were more likely to be a kind of acute stress, not, I have kids all of a sudden that never stop screaming. And so the body in that situation is like, aha, it would be more beneficial to have energy at a consistently elevated level so that I can do things like run my brain and my muscles at their optimal state. And so that really is the primary role of cortisol. Like I was saying earlier, cortisol does a number of sort of things that relate to athletic performance. One of them being like I was saying, it breaks down protein into amino acids, and it takes amino acids and runs them through this other process to convert them into glucose, essentially carbohydrates for fuel. And so that's one of its major to but it also does things like impact the immune system as well, where it can be relatively negative or immunosuppressive, or at least to some extent change the immune system away from the ability to optimally function at an optimal level. And the analogy that I use for people is, have you ever had a really stressful phase of your life and then like literally the second it's over, you get sick?
Yes.
Yes.
100%.
So what's going on in that situation?
Every camp.
Yeah. So what's going on in that situation is this. Your body during this heightened state is producing a relatively large amount of increased cortisol. That cortisol is suppressing your immune system down to a point where it's not doing a great job of fighting whatever virus or bacterial infection you have going on. You finally resolve that stress. Let's say you take your final exam of your college semester, right? And you're like, and you relax. Those cortisol levels plummet. Your immune system's like, bingo, it takes off, and you feel like dog shit, like basically immediately. Mm-hmm. This used to happen to me, I don't know, at least a couple of times every year in college. And so that's one of those things that can, that definitely can happen. So, not necessarily great if you have too much of it there as well.
We just want to touch on that for a second, because it's interesting you brought that up. Sadie and I were lucky enough to go and listen to a lecture by Dr. Andrew Huberman a couple of weeks ago out here in Portland. Yep. And this topic was discussed, and he was specifically talking about this type of situation. Yep. Have a stressful event, come down for it, and specifically right afterwards, you get sick as your body kind of starts to normalize again. He was saying that a good way to combat that is to kind of wean yourself off it, like try to do something not extremely stressful, but to keep that level of stress somewhat active and kind of wean off of it rather than just dropping off completely. And that's a better way to kind of manage this down slope of a stressful event to kind of keep yourself from getting sick when you're done.
I mean, I think in theory it's a nice concept. I think it's relatively difficult to actually implement.
Sure.
Huberman is great. He's like incredibly smart dude, right? Like, obviously he's successful for what he does. I think sometimes the advice is hard to actually implement in the real world scenario. But I like the concept of it for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, in general,
about like arm wrestling competitions right after camp, just to kind of keep the Jordan was up for that.
For sure. I'm going to start training if we do that. That's for sure. I don't want to get beat by, I don't know, definitely Chad and you.
Yeah. Right. Cortisol in general throughout the day. This was always like very, something that I've been aware of because, I got tested with Jamie and she noticed there was a pretty significant
flip
problem. Yes, basically a complete flip for what a daily kind of charting of where your cortisol levels should look like. Mine looked like the complete opposite.
Okay.
And my cortisol levels were low in the morning and then ramped up at night, something you don't really want to see. Yeah. And some of it was potentially due to what we see with a lot of athletes these days, especially competitive athletes, traveling a lot.
Yeah.
You're on the road a lot, you're in different time zones, you're in different countries, you don't sleep really well, and it affects some of these things. Some of it is stress related. But for the athletes out there that might have something similar in terms of them being in a lot of different places and bouncing around a lot,
sure.
Is there a way for them to potentially combat this, off cycle of cortisol to get things back in order?
Yeah, for sure. So let's back up for a second for your listeners. So cortisol goes through what we call like a diurnal pattern. A diurnal simply means like a 24-hour rhythm. And it sort of correlates with like sunlight, for lack of a better term. So we want our cortisol levels to be the highest in the morning, and that typically is driven by the actual wake up process. So the act of waking up drives a spike in cortisol, and at that point, it'll be at its highest level throughout the day. As the day starts to go on, it gets lower and lower, and by evening time, cortisol should be at its lowest point. And this is beneficial because cortisol, in addition to all the things that we've already talked about, is sort of like a wake-up hormone. Basically helps you to wake up. And again, from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. If your energy levels are dropping, right, which would be triggered by low blood glucose, that causes an induction of cortisol. It wakes you up to go find food. Makes perfect sense. And then at nighttime, we want these levels low so that we can go to bed. What Dave's describing and what we see in, I would say, a relatively large number of people in the modern world is a flipped cortisol profile, or we call this tired and wired. So every morning, the alarm clock goes off and you could easily hit snooze 10 times before you get up. And maybe you need 1, 2, 3 cups of coffee before you really get going. And then you kind of grind yourself through the day. It gets a little bit better, especially after you exercise. And then right around like 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock or so, you're like, I'm wide awake. And I could go and work for hours right now. So that's like, if you don't have the ability or the financials to make one of these salivary cortisol tests, which are relatively expensive to get done, that's something you could just kind of think about your daily routine. So yeah, so in that situation, what can we do? What my approach has been is there's a category of supplements out there called adaptogens. And these are herbal medicines that actually have scientific support behind them. I'm a very evidence-based guy that have the ability to an extent, in some form or other, modulate the production of cortisol. And so there are certain ones that you could take in the morning that would help to induce the production of cortisol, things like rhodiola. You could also think potentially about something like licorice root. And there are others to help the body make more cortisol. And then in the evening time, there's another entire class of things, such as ashwagandha, GABA, which is a relatively common one that people might be familiar with, to help your body start to slow or dampen that process down. And so the thought process is that if you can have something to help drive it in the morning and decrease the night, overall, that may help to regulate that. I would also add, thinking of Dr. Huberman, coming back to him, one of the big things that he talks about is light exposure. So if you are traveling and crossing time zones, especially, one of the things that you can do if you're going to be there, especially for a couple of days, is wake up and get that early, what he calls like, early morning or bent light, that, dawn light, and just go outside for 10, 15 minutes and kind of generally look at it. Don't stare at the sun, don't go crazy. But, get that exposure on the eyes, and that this can actually trigger the brain to calibrate itself more appropriately. And then same thing in that late afternoon, early evening, when it's dusk and that light is starting to change color again, that bent light again, go outside again and just be outside and let your eyes see that. Don't have your sunglasses on or anything else like that. And this can help reprogram the brain in a fairly impressive manner to get those appropriate cycles back to help with things like cortisol production as well. So, some very safe adaptogens that you could take, combined with a very cheap, completely, free process of going outside and looking at the sunlight, can help in a major, major way.
It sounds like, Chad, I'll jump in there a second. Let me just finish up this one thought on what he just mentioned. It sounds like a lot of what you're discussing has to do with sleep as well. And we didn't really mention sleep in there at all, but, trying to calm down and relax at night, and whether it comes through the adaptogens that you mentioned, the GABA or ashwagandha, or maybe magnesium and L-theanine, I don't know if they fit into those as other things to kind of help with sleep cycles and things like that. Is that kind of where this is going, to be able to not just get your cortisol levels down, but also to be able to get to a point where then your sleep cycle is in order as well? Do those kind of sync up?
Totally. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, obviously sleep's a more complex thing than just cortisol. There's like a massive number of other hormones such as melatonin, serotonin, at play. We could do an entire lecture. Although you should probably have Allison on for that one, not me. But there absolutely is connections between cortisol and sleep patterning for sure. Whether it's that flipped profile that we've already talked about with Dave, or there's a huge number of other things that I'm happy to walk through really quickly, where as a nutrition coach, I look at somebody's wake patterns, like how many times are you waking up in the middle of the night? Do you have to go to the bathroom? Are you able to easily fall asleep again, or are you tossing and turning for hours? That tell me a lot of things about what's likely going on with your cortisol during the daytime hours, and will help me to make recommendations to you as an athlete based on or around topics like how much food that we should be eating versus what we are eating, and whether or not you perhaps need to modulate your training in a short-term scenario to get these hormones, specifically cortisol, under control, and then we can start to ramp things back up again. So yeah, cortisol and sleep patterns are incredibly important, I think.
Okay. And Chad, I'm sorry, I have one more question around this.
You're good.
Training times throughout the day. Now, it seems like from what you're saying, you're at your best. You should be most ready to go if you have a correct cortisol pattern to wake up in the morning and train then. Sometimes it's not possible for work reasons,
Right.
life reasons. Some people like to work out later in the day. Is there something optimal that you found or that you've directed people towards in terms of, hey, if you're having an issue with your cortisol levels, let's try to push those training sessions more to earlier in the day and see if that benefits it?
So to an extent, yes, right? Like I think just basing your training around when exactly your cortisol levels are at its highest is not necessarily something that we should be doing. But I think it is something that we should be taking into consideration, because that cortisol response is actually a good thing when you're training. So like we said, there's a daily pattern, like this diurnal pattern of cortisol production, but then there's also like little spikes that occur throughout the day. And one of those spikes is driven by training, specifically training with any sort of intensity. CrossFit would absolutely fall into that category. I would argue, even though it's perhaps not considered as high intensity from a heavy breathing perspective, I would say gymnastics and weightlifting absolutely do as well, just due to the sort of neurological stress. Like you guys both did this for your career, you could finish a session, even if you only exercise for a maximum, like let's say 20 minutes of literal movement over the course of several hours, your brain dead, right? You're just crushed by it. It's a stressful experience. And so that drives a relatively large cortisol spike as well. So if somebody is in a situation where their patterns are not great, they're all over the place, I might suggest that they start training more so in the morning, because we can use that exercise, we can use that training with intensity to actually drive cortisol production. And that's when they're going to be making the most amount of it anyway, or they should be. And so that you'll get a good beneficial impact from that as well. If you have to train in the afternoon, or more importantly, in the evening time, and you're going to get this massive production of cortisol as a result of doing, a lot of intense work, then one of the things that we can do to help the body stop the production is actually to take in a relatively large amount of glucose or carbohydrate in the post-workout window. Why? One of the best ways to shut down cortisol production is to spike your blood sugar. And so you'll often see me with my athletes being like, when you finish your workout, in the next half an hour, I want you to have 25 grams of protein and 50 grams of carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are there for the most part to stop that stress response, to get the brain out and the body really out of this, flight or fight response for one. Two, to stop or at least down regulate the production of cortisol and to get us into the repair process. So that for me is a big thing, especially in evening training. Like as soon as that workout's done, let's get some carbohydrates in, and then let's do some dedicated breathing work. Get yourself out of that sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight response, and into the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest, the feed and breathe system.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah, definitely building off of that. And first of all, more generally, not just with cortisol, and considering how can one use the knowledge of hormones to optimize their training and health. And what I really mean by that, from what I'm looking for and what I want you to answer, is is it better to overtrain versus not training at all? Or when should you skip training?
Yeah.
And when should you surge ahead? And a good example that I can give you is that I'm training for a master's competition right now, and I have to go to nationals in Las Vegas here in about a week. And I'm going to be there for like a week and a half.
Sure.
I'm going to be working long days, helping with the meet and stuff like that. So I'm tempted to skip training, but I don't really want to do that for a week and a half. But I know my schedule is going to be random. My food's going to be random. My sleep is going to be random. So that's just kind of an example of saying, when is it better to skip and when is it better to surge ahead? Right. Or for me, like what I'm planning to do right now is try to go in and do a little something on most of those days, 15 to 30 minutes, but just kind of read my body and definitely go lighter than I normally would.
100%. I think you nailed it right on the head, Chad. And I think that's the experience of somebody who's done this for a long period of time versus a less experienced athlete who may just try to like literally force their way through a session when they really shouldn't be. So if you're an athlete and you have competitive goals, taking a 10-day window off completely from training is probably not going to be helpful. I would also argue that if you're in a situation where you're going to be on your feet, 10, 12 hours a day, stress levels are already going to be elevated, that trying to complete your normal amount of training on top of that would be equally as deleterious and not advisable. And so in that situation, what you need to do is think about what would progress actually look like. Might actually just be maintenance, right? So like, what is the minimum effective dose that I need to do to keep my squat where I want it, to keep my technique where I want it, and hit that number. And so if you can get that in 30 minutes in the morning by saying like, hey, I'm going to work up to one heavy set of squats, and, I'm going to make that a really impactful set. I'm going to put some intensity into it, and I'm going to move on, I'm going to move on to my next piece, as opposed to when you normally train, you might rest 5-6 minutes between, hit that a couple of times, etc. Your goal in that scenario is to maintain as opposed to continue to build. And I think you've also hit the nail on the head, which is, if you're going to do that, doing it during a time in the day before you're mentally fatigued, before you've already dealt with, 12 hours of increased cortisol production and all the other things that come with it, is a good idea as well. I remember last year we were at the games with Jordan, and he was doing the Murph challenge, and he was talking about how, like, at the end of the day, and literally the last thing he wants to do is go do his 2 miles of running, 100 push-ups or 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, right? But in the morning, it may not be the fastest time he's ever going to get done, but he's still able to do it, right? And that's just an example of, like, you've got to set yourself up for success. And if it's important to you, you'll wake up early enough to get it done, knowing that you may not hit your exact numbers, but the stimulus of it will be beneficial for you compared to either doing nothing or trying to do it at the end of the day when it's just going to be a hot mess.
Right. And to kind of add to that, how beneficial or how powerful is exercise to your hormones and keeping them healthy and in line? And what I mean by that is, if a human is on point with everything else except they're just inactive and they don't exercise at all, they're on point with sleep, nutrition, everything, are they going to be better off than an individual that is working out, doing CrossFit, say 4 or 5 days a week, but they're not on point? They sleep, 4 or 5 hours a night. Their nutrition isn't great. Who's better off in that scenario?
Yeah, good question. What we know, it's a hard question to answer, but I will say that there's this study called the EROS study. And what they did is they took a number of different groups from CrossFit classes, and they looked at people that had self-described symptoms of being sort of, either healthy or overtrained. And they compared them to individuals that were also untrained, so people that weren't working out at all. And what we saw is that the people that were doing CrossFit but felt good, felt healthy, had substantially better hormones across a lot of the different things that we've talked about today compared to the untrained population. However, the people that were training and were showing symptoms of overtraining, their hormones looked very similar, or in many cases actually worse than the untrained population. Things such as cortisol, things such as the sex hormones, all were not in places that you would expect them to be for somebody who was working out relatively hard on a day-to-day basis. And when they looked at other factors that correlated strongly with this group of overtrained individuals, the number one thing that they found was that the people that were overtrained were consuming 3 times less carbohydrates than everybody else. And so, of course, the study is not causative. It's not there to say that that's the cause. But from a nutritional perspective, I can back that up with a lot of real world experience to say that if you start to feed those people more appropriately, a lot of those symptoms of overtraining go away. So I think I answered your question and provided another little fun detail there at the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you were explaining that, it sounds like to me, it comes back to the basic concept that is really hard to answer with and for people to hear is balance.
Yeah.
We need balance and all that.
Totally, 100%. The analogy that I like to use actually comes from Hinshaw, where he talks about you've got this bucket, and when you're in an anaerobic state, you're filling the bucket faster than the spout at the bottom is letting fluid come out, right? And I think you can use the same exact analogy with stress in your life. You've got a spout coming in and you've got a spout coming out. And if you're going to ramp up the stress response coming in, you're going to open that faucet up. You, to some extent, need to have things in place to open up the other one further. And if you don't, at some point, that bucket's going to overfill and there will for sure be consequences.
Now, Mike, I think the intention when we first started out was say like, hey, let's try to hit this topic in 30 minutes. And it's impossible. It's just not, it's not the kind of thing that we feel comfortable with the amount of knowledge that you have on these topics and the amount of talking points and tangents that we can go on. Sure. And so with that being said, and us coming close to an hour, are you cool talking about the last one I haven't mentioned yet and talk a little bit about HGH and just a little bit about, we mentioned a little bit in terms of its relationship to testosterone, in terms of its muscle building factors, but can we talk about this category a little bit and how it factors into the training world?
Yeah, for sure. So human growth hormone is a hormone that promotes growth in general, increases your muscle mass, promotes fat metabolism. It's incredibly important for things like weight loss, injury recovery, athletic training, et cetera, et cetera. I think people often assume that growth hormone is a little bit of like a miracle drug in the same way that people take testosterone and they say, aha, I'm going to feel like Superman. Unfortunately, not the case. So it is an incredibly important hormone that does a large number of things within the body and is produced extremely effectively by exercise. But don't go rush out the door looking for somebody to get you a prescription for growth hormone the way that many people are doing for testosterone, because it's not quite the same thing there. It's one of those things that the more is not necessarily always the better, despite, people like from the Major League Baseball and stuff like that getting busted for it. So important hormone, really critical for a large number of processes that we associate with health, like more muscle mass, lower body fat, fat metabolism, and things of that nature. But I think, let's just put it this way, perhaps a little overrated for what it might potentially be from a marketing perspective.
Are you saying purely from an artificial HGH standpoint?
Yeah,
You're saying people like getting more than what their body's naturally making?
Exactly.
From outside of things. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So like I'm saying, like I said, important for muscle mass. It also has some impacts on like your brain and its ability to learn and remember things. It's important for wound healing. So people that have low growth hormone production, which can be caused, bringing it all back together, by over production of cortisol, are more likely to be injured and things of that nature. It's an important hormone for sure. I don't want to underestimate it. I think comparative to some of the other ones, it's, I don't want to say less important, but people sometimes think of this as a magic pill, and it's just not in that case. So.
And are there ways to naturally increase HGH rather than taking an artificial source of it?
Totally, absolutely. So they're going to sound really familiar to things that we've already talked about. So one is reducing your body fat levels. So if you are somebody that's overweight or obese, doing things to reduce that, high quality diet, exercise, etc., is one thing. Building off of that is exercise in and of itself has been shown to help be a stimulator of growth hormone. Another one, there was one what I call a meta-analysis, which is sort of like a summary of other studies that showed that there may be benefits from something like intermittent fasting as well. And that might be something that's, I would just argue, beneficial for people that are not necessarily able to exercise as much as they might want to. A lot of the benefits from intermittent fasting kind of overlap with exercise and are not necessarily additive or synergistic. So if you're ever in a place where perhaps you're maybe you're injured and you're not able to exercise, let's say you hurt your back, can't exercise, and you want to keep your growth hormone levels up, maybe that's a scenario where you might want to do that as well. Another very smart person, I want to make sure I give her credit on this, Rhonda Patrick, you've probably heard of her. She talks an awful lot about sauna being a good way to promote growth hormone production as well. She has like hour-plus long videos on YouTube for anybody that wants to dive into that subject to show how that can enhance growth hormone production as well. So that's a big one. Sleep for sure. Getting 7+ hours of sleep per night is a big one. My understanding is that outside of like these exercise-induced spikes in growth hormone, is that the hours that we sleep is the time when growth hormone production will be the highest. And so if you are not getting enough sleep, you are limiting your ability to produce this important hormone as well. So that's pretty much like the big ones that I can think of. There are some supplements out there that kind of like promote it. Things like glutamine and arginine, which are just amino acids that are sort of involved in that process. But at the end of the day, if you're having a high quality, high protein diet, which I think the vast majority of your listeners are, I don't think you need to go out and supplement with those things to kind of boost your growth hormone.
Interesting. So just one note there that we are, for all of you listeners out there considering coming to Power Monkey Camp, we added cold therapy with Ice Barrel coming on board not that long ago, and that's been a nice addition. And we are actually just looking to add sauna to camp as well. So we're in the final stages of having a sauna sponsor come on board. So for those of you coming in the fall in 2023, anticipate being able to potentially add some of that sauna experience, some HGH therapy in there as well.
I'm putting it out there now. I'm going to do all my individual one-on-one like nutrition chats, either in the sauna or a cold plunge. You have to be in one plunge. Just me like constantly in those things all day. It's gonna be great.
Just one last thing before we get you out of your mic. We talked about the great things that HGH do for the body, how to increase those levels, the potential benefits of an artificial addition, maybe it not being so great as something like testosterone. But I'm curious for something that basically helps the body grow in so many ways. Are there negatives to adding in or potential some deleterious things that can happen from adding artificial HGH to growing things unnaturally in the body, say like a cancer formation or things like that later down the road? Does it have potential negative effects in those ways, or any research done around that?
Yeah, for sure. Anything that involves like cell division and proliferation is definitely a risk. There's a reason why HGH isn't just an over-the-counter type medication. Too much of it definitely can have negative consequences for the body. And yeah, you're nailing it right on the head as it relates to things such as cancer. But also, there are organs in the body that we don't necessarily want to get bigger as well. And if you take artificially high levels of growth hormone, there are certain tissues, certain organs that will also respond to that in a way that they perhaps may not to what we call endogenous levels, which simply just means like the amount that your body normally would produce. And so those are also things that you would want to potentially, I think, avoid. So yeah, 100%. There are definitely deleterious consequences to that one as well.
Yeah, I was hearing Dr. David Sinclair talk about this in relation to his anti-aging protocols and just longevity in general, how to promote, a longer life, living to potentially 150 and beyond within the next generation. And him discussing a little bit about these hormone therapies and how they can potentially, have some great benefits in the now, but in terms of longevity, then potentially having more harm than good. And maybe something around what you're talking about.
I think so. I mean, there's also some just sort of like more minor side effects with growth hormone, like muscle aches, joint discomfort. I think there's a pretty substantial increase in headaches. Don't quote me on that one, but I think the thought process there is that growth hormone causes the body to retain a relatively sizable amount of fluid as well. And so that would cause changes in things that would cause headaches. And if you have a situation where retaining fluid, like you have a pre-existing condition where having more fluid in the body, like heart attacks and strokes, that's going to be a exacerbation of that risk as well. So again, it comes back much like we talked about with testosterone, where you want to know your family history if you're going to even think about doing these things, even under the guidance of a physician. Nowadays, it's like the wild, wild west out there. You can get a doctor to prescribe you pretty much anything, especially if you live in certain states. And, you know, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you want to do it, for sure.
Totally fair. Chad, I'll let you finish up, but just my last question for you, Mike, anything that you're taking right now as an athlete, someone who's still training pretty regularly that you'd recommend? Any of the things for cortisol levels or anything out there that you're taking that you would say, hey, you know, I've seen the benefit firsthand, anything that you would recommend?
Yeah, for sure. So let me think for a second here. As it relates to sort of hormonal health, I definitely take an ashwagandha supplement in the afternoon and before bedtime. So I take about 650 milligrams late afternoon and 650 milligrams before bed to try to help with me and my stress levels, because 2 kids, you know, a couple full-time jobs, my stress can run pretty high. So that's one that I take for sure.
Sorry, Mike, can you repeat what that was, that first one?
Oh, ashwagandha.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
It sounds like a magic mushroom that would get you high, but all it does, it's pretty safe actually. And it's crazy actually. There are really cool studies that show correlations between consumption of that and increased testosterone levels to connect it all back together. Most likely due to improving sleep patterns. So probably a secondary impact there. So I take that. I do take a cocktail of adaptogens in the morning as well. It's a product called Max Adrenal from a company called Nova 3 Labs. I've had a relationship on some level or another with them forever. Reach out if you're interested in learning more about that, or discount codes or whatever. I take that. And then I've experimented over the years with things like magnesium and GABA and L-theanine and a number of those. I've never seen consistent benefits from the vast majority of them. That's not to say that they won't work for you. I've just tried them and I've kind of taken them out from there. So really, that's the only thing I think about. You know, all the supplemental stuff as it relates to testosterone, if anybody's thinking about Tribulus and stuff like that, the research is extremely weak comparative to getting, you know, 7-8 hours of sleep per night, like just completely, you know, minimalistic effects. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
All right.
Awesome.
I'm on my way to pick up some ashwagandha right now. So
yeah,
there you go.
The best part, it's super cheap too. And it is incredibly safe. So that's the nice part about it.
Yeah. I think I actually have some in the house. I just hadn't been taking it. So I'm going to get back. I'm going to get back on that for sure. But Mike, as always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you again for joining us. Anything you got coming up you want folks to know about, or for anyone that might be listening for the first time, where can they keep up with you?
Yeah, for sure. So if for some reason you absolutely love geeking out about this stuff as much as I do, come check out our education series on the M2 website. We just wrapped up our hormonal health course, ironically enough, about a month ago. We have a whole series on other things like that. And we've got a new course coming out in a couple of months as well. So go check that out if you've really enjoyed these topics and want to learn more.
Website.
Yeah, you just go to my website to check that out. There's a little education tab at the top. Click on that and you'll get all the information you want.
Beautiful. Perfect. Well, as always, to our listeners, we very much appreciate you guys listening in. Be sure to head over to Power Monkey Fitness for services and upcoming events. Also check out our Instagram pages for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, at Dave Durante, and at Ollie Chad. And on behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn with Dave Durante. And until next time, guys, thank you all for listening.